In this video, we'll discuss authentication. Authentication is a core part of identity and access management, and it really means proof of identity, whether we're talking about a user, a device, or an application. Authentication has multiple categories that can be used, such as something you know. That would include something like a username and a password or a PIN. Another category for authentication is something you have. That would include things like a PKI certificate, or a hardware or software token, or even a smart card. The third category is something you are. For biometric authentication, this will include things like fingerprints, voice recognition scans, or retinal scans. Multifactor authentication is often referred to as MFA. It's a combination of at least two authentication categories. So, for example, something you know, like a PIN, and something you have, like a smart card. So together, you can use that information and that device for authentication. Multi-factor authentication does constitute at least two authentication categories, but the two items cannot be in the same category. That would not constitute MFA. So, for example, username and password are two items, but they are the same category. They're both something you know. So therefore, username and password are not considered multi-factor authentication. With authentication, we need an identity store. So think of things like user accounts. Where are they stored? So user accounts then might be stored in an LDAP-compliant database, such as Microsoft Active Directory Domain Services databases. We can also configure radius authentication, which allows for a centralized authentication provider. Edge devices like network switches and VPN appliances will forward their authentication requests from their clients to the radius server. So in other words, edge network devices like switches, VPN appliances, wireless routers, they would not perform authentication. Instead, they forward it to the radius server, which does the authentication. Identity Federation is a centralized trusted identity provider where we have a single copy of credentials. So applications then themselves do not perform authentication. Instead, they forward authentication requests to the identity provider. In turn, the identity provider then sends a digitally signed security token to the app after successful authentication. Security tokens can contain what are called claims about users or devices. A claim is basically an assertion about a user or device, such as a date of birth, a department a device resides in, and so on. Identity Federation is often used for web single sign-on for internal or public cloud apps so that users don't have to keep re-entering the same credentials as they access different applications. Finally, authentication can also be context-based. So, in addition, for example, to a smart card and a PIN, we might look at the time of day to determine if someone is allowed to authenticate, or their location, which could be based on GPS tracking, or the frequency of how often they authenticate, or other behavioral characteristics. In this video, we discussed authentication.